Good evening and welcome to the UMDemocracy 2022 series. As you may know, the series aims to provide resources and information on things to know for the midterm election this November. Tonight, we're focusing on social media. My name is Amy Eichhorst. I'm the Associate Vice President of Alumni and Donor Relations and Executive Director of the Alumni Association. I'll be serving as your host this evening, and I'm looking forward to a lively discussion. Our esteemed faculty presenters are approaching the topic of social media from different angles. And if you have questions tonight, which we hope you do, during the discussion, please feel free to share them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, as we'll have a Q&A segment toward the end of the program. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our moderator for tonight's discussion, Dr. Ernesto Calvo. Dr. Calvo is the director of the Interdisciplinary Lab for Computational Social Science and the professor of government and politics at the University of Maryland. His research centers on the study of comparative political institutions, social media, political representation, and social networks. His work lies at the intersection of big data, survey experiments, and institutions. Professor Calvo has authored more than 70 publications in the United States, Latin America and the Caribbean, and Europe. His research has been recognized by the American Political Science Association with the Lawrence Longley Award, the Lubert Best Article Award, and the Miker Wallerstein Award. Please welcome Dr. Calvo.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy, and welcome everyone to tonight's discussion. It's great to have another session, and I'm excited to have two distinguished panelists here for our conversation, Sarah Oates and Sarah McGrew. Sarah McGrew is an assistant professor in the Department of Teaching and Learning Policy and Leadership in the College of Education at the University of Maryland, College Park. She studies educational responses to the spread of online mis- and disinformation. Her research focuses on how young people search for and evaluate online information and contentious social and political topics, and how schools can better support students to learn effective evaluation strategies. Sarah Oates is a scholar in the field of communication and democratization. A major theme in her work is the way in which traditional media and the internet can support or subvert democracy in places as diverse as Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Professor Oates is also a research director for a college and affiliate professor in the UMD Department of Communication and also in the high school. So welcome, colleagues, and let's get the conversation started. So I hope you're having an enjoyable pre-election season. It is not the first time that we are so polarized in the US, but it's certainly the first time that we can express our polarization in a digital format, the first time that we do it with the presence of social media. So what is different about polarization in the social media environment, and how can we manage polarization? I don't know, Sarah Oates, if you want to start.
Sure. I think that we're all looking to election 2022 with great interest and I guess a sense of, will we return to normal? Will it be like 2020? How much will some of the rhetoric around election security and election fraud rear its head again? And it's important to talk about that because that's very much linked with the online sphere. So in every election, we see there's always a surprise about what's going on in social media. I think 2020 delivered an enormous surprise, most notably by heavily contributing to the Capitol insurrection in early 2021. What will be our surprise this time? I'm really torn, and I'm really interested to hear what other Sarah has to say, because apparently you had to be named Sarah to be on this panel. I'm not quite sure. Will we return to business as usual with a lot of people in their filter bubbles, talking to other like-minded people, being very surprised by election outcomes because they're not really contacting much with the other side? Or will it be a reset where people are acting more in the way we would expect in a democracy? So I'd love to know what Sarah McGrew thinks about all this.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think I'm going to have to take the pessimistic answer in this case, which is I think we're headed for something more similar to 2020. And I think that's for several reasons. I think it's important to stay early on, right? That like mis and disinformation, false information isn't a new phenomenon by any means, right? It was not invented with the internet. But we know that there are particular things about the internet and particularly about social media that just exacerbate a lot of the problems that we see with both polarization and misinformation, right? That like there are so many creators and it's so we have many more opinions, many more fringe opinions really. And then it spreads so much more quickly, right? And like Sarah Oates already mentioned, we get into these filter bubbles, right? Partially through our own choices about what kinds of news and information we consume, but also because social media is driven by algorithms, right? These like complex sets of rules that are feeding content to us that are and want us to stay on those social media sites and are therefore feeding us content that they think that we will engage with. Right. And the things that we engage with most are things that make us either really excited and happy or really angry. Right. And those are the same things that polarize us. So and we know, and social media companies know that that's the case, right? But continue to sort of incentivize our viewing really polarized content. So I don't have a lot of faith that will change. And then on the sort of supply side, which is where I focus most of my attention, right? Like people's ability to make choices about what to trust online. I just don't see. I think that there's reason for optimism there. We can teach people to do a better job, but I don't think we really have so far. And there's not a lot of support for that. So I don't have a lot of optimism on that.
I have a little more optimism, although because I'm a political scientist, I'm basically a very pessimistic person, which probably Ernesto agrees with as being a political scientist. I think there's two big differences. And one difference is you could say that what happened in 2020 and what happened during the Capitol insurrection was a huge wake-up call to the public. It does not appear to have been a huge wake-up call to the social media platforms. You couldn't say 2 years on, they fixed the problem of the toxic algorithm, that they're doing a good job with disinformation. Yeah, there's a lot of challenges in that area, but I would say they could do a lot better, but they're still putting profits ahead of user safety, in my view. The second thing is Trump. Trump is no longer on mainstream social media. And if there's one thing that Democrats and Republicans agree on, it's that the rules for who gets to be on or off social media, no one's happy with them. Democrats aren't happy with them. Republicans certainly aren't happy with them. And I think on both sides, there's a case to answer. So, of course, Trump has founded Truth Social. Only about 6%, I think, of the Trump supporters or sort of the general overall electorate are on it. So it's a very different thing. So those are the two things. And of course, the third thing is, Trump is no longer the incumbent. Okay, this is not a presidential election. So, okay, who cares to a sense. But Trump also was a very vocal proponent of the idea that the election was not fair, right? So it's not so much, that's not like somebody's Facebook group down the street talking about that. That's the leader of the free world and the president of the United States telling you that. So that's different, right? That's not just about social media influence. That's about the most powerful man in the world telling you something. So he doesn't have that particular pulpit anymore, although he has a very strong support. So I'll be very interested to see how that narrative continues to play out.
So we tend to think that people do not change their mind often. We tend to think that it's very difficult to change people's minds and therefore to prevent them from believing things that are being produced and being circulated on social media and misinformation that is being circulated. So we have this competing problem in which we want people to be sensitive enough to realize that something is false, and at the same time, we acknowledge that they seldom change the idea that they have before. So can we educate citizens and immunize them against polarization so that they do not share misinformation, even though they might not change their mind on the extent that they support that misinformation? Sarah?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I will start by saying that part of the reason I work with young people, and I'm an educator, so I think a lot about middle school and high school and college students, and their minds are a little bit more flexible, right? They're still open to change in a way that by the time we get to adulthood, we're not always. So that's part of my answer, is it starts young, and so I think we should put a lot of focus there and a lot of resources there. But I think there's a couple of responses to your question. The first is that people are just, for the most part, really bad at evaluating information. So I think that there's a lot of room for growth in just helping people do a slightly better job deciding what's reliable and what's not online. And that if we boosted their skills just a little bit, they might make better judgments than we give them credit for. But that also we need to be realistic about the role, right, that our own political affiliations in this case play in how we judge information, but that too is something that we can help people sort of reflect on a little bit and learn to think about, and potentially prioritize accuracy in some cases. So I want to talk about both of those pieces a little bit more. On the first part, that we're all pretty bad at evaluating information, and I mostly study students, like I said, but I've also done studies, for example, with college professors, with history professors at top universities, and found that they often struggled to evaluate online information. So this is really a problem that, like, unless you have had explicit instruction, and I would say instruction in the last probably 5 years in how to evaluate information, you're likely making some mistakes, right? Like we find that young people assume that you can evaluate websites based on their top level domain, like whether they're a .org or a .com, and assume that .org websites are more reliable than .com. We know from other scientific research that folks assume that social media posts that have a lot of engagement, so that have like lots of likes and shares, are more reliable than posts with less engagement. And those things are both completely untrue, but yet we continue to sort of sustain these myths. And there are some really simple ways to more effectively evaluate information. So when I was in graduate school, I did a study with my advisor, Sam Weinberg, where we looked at how professional fact checkers evaluated information. So folks who are fact checkers at leading national news and fact checking organizations. And we found, not surprisingly, that those fact checkers always prioritized investigating the source, right? They came across something they didn't know and they asked, like, who is behind this? Where is this coming from, right? So that should be the first question we're always asking. But then they had a really specific move that they used to evaluate a source or investigate a source. And that was something we called lateral reading, right? So they left the site. So in this case, like if they were on social media looking at a source, they got out of social media and just searched for more information about the name of the source in other external sources, right? Whether it was Wikipedia or a news story or something else, and just quickly, got a sense of whether that was a fake news organization or, had a really strong political ideology, and then could return to the social media post with like a little bit more context for what they were reading, or just choose to ignore it altogether. So we've designed educational interventions to teach strategies like lateral reading to high school and college students, and found that they do a lot better, right? They struggle a lot to begin with. We teach strategies like lateral reading, and people can learn to do better, to do a better job evaluating information. So I think that's really hopeful. And I think to my second point, then, we can also acknowledge the reality that, of course, who we are and what we believe and how we feel is also influencing how we evaluate information. So even if we know how to read laterally, if we see a post that makes us really angry, it's less likely that we will, engage in some really effective lateral reading. But we also know that we can, teach ourselves, hopefully, to kind of slow down, take a deep breath, and then remind ourselves that accuracy is important, right? Even if a post makes us really angry, it's important to be accurate. So we should engage in just a little more time to read laterally or evaluate the information in some other way. So I think there's hope. There's a lot of room for growth, but there's room for hope there.
So imagine Sarah McGrew does an amazing job, and everyone is so well educated that they are immunized against the disinformation, and they do not amplify all of that. But we know that overwhelmingly misinformation is produced and circulated by a very small number of people, and oftentimes with very clear political intentions. both in policy, politics, intelligence. There are a whole lot of areas. So if we educate citizens and minimize mis and disinformation sharing, we might not reduce the amount of mis and disinformation that people are still consuming through other venues. So how do we ensure a healthier digital media environment if it's not only people, the one that are regulating what comes in and out from our digital? I don't know, Sarah Oates?
Well, yeah, I'm actually fascinated by what Sarah McGrew said, and I think it's really interesting to interact with our students, because in some ways they're very good at collecting information, but they're not always that good at judging the relative value of that information. Well, in the journalism college, obviously, we're training them very hard from freshmen, so they tend to be a little bit better. But I was chuckling this week because there was some survey about how some people think, professors are too liberal, or, we should worry about what professors are saying in the classroom. I'm thinking, I'm faced by 20 people who all have Google in front of them. I can't get away with much. But to your point, so I look at the supply side, right? And that's what I'm more concerned with specifically right now. I'm working on a book about how Russian disinformation infiltrates our news system in the United States. Like, what kinds of things do news outlets pick up on unknowingly that are really Kremlin talking points? And of course, some people do this with the knowledge they are repeating Kremlin talking points. And I think it's particularly important. I mean, it's one thing if your neighbor Bob says something about, Ukraine, and it's a different thing if you're repeating a Kremlin talking point. So I'm very interested in digital forensics that can separate that out, can highlight propaganda narratives versus what would be, more normal speech. And I'm particularly interested in the ways in which foreign powers push conspiracy theories on us, such as NATO has always been out to get Russia. And can make that conspiracy theory stick in a way that can be very corrosive to having a more reasoned, informed conversation about foreign relations. So I am very much of the belief that platforms and also our government need to focus much more on controlling the disinformation supply chains. And by this, I mean disinformation. I mean things that is malign information that you can identify either its source or intent is out to harm our civil society. And the final point I want to make about this is an analogy I use a lot, which is, many years ago, we decided to regulate factories dumping waste in local rivers and streams and lakes. And we did this because we wanted to protect the environment. And it was at the cost of profit, of course, for some businesses, because it's much more expensive to have to clean your waste. But I think we're at that point with social media platforms where we really have to put the onus on them not to distribute, and knowingly, as they do, distribute malicious disinformation, particularly from people we know who are enemies of the United States.
So we find Sarah McGrew that educates our young not to share misinformation as information, and then Sarah Oates produces legislation, and we reduce the amount of misinformation as information is coming. But even in that case, people are receiving some mis and disinformation, and we still need to know, how they process that for tolerance. So to what extent can we educate not just so that they screen mis and disinformation, but can we actually educate so that when they see this kind of information, they're not polarized, and they're not activated, they're not angry, and therefore politics is not the politics that we see in the digital environment, even if misinformation is information and present.
Yeah, and I just want to pick up on the point that Sarah Oates was making, because I absolutely agree that the government and social media companies need to do a better job regulating, controlling disinformation. But like you said, Ernesto, there's always going to be the presence of misinformation or misleading information on social media, right? Because they're not going to be able to regulate everything. And there's lots of content on social media that's technically true in some ways, but like either from a very skewed perspective, or only showing part of the story, right? That like probably wouldn't get regulated away, but we still need people to learn how to think about, because those kinds of posts can be really polarizing too. So I think, again, starting young, ideally, right, we're both teaching those effective evaluation strategies that I was talking about, but also teaching students some more sort of what might be construed as like sort of classic media literacy, right? And news literacy, right? Like thinking about what are the, what's across the political spectrum? What are some of the different media outlets? What is a reliable news organization? And more importantly, like, why are they reliable? What are the actual processes that, major news organizations have in place to try to produce accurate information and admit mistakes when they make them, and what contrasts those organizations from, organizations that might call themselves news, but really are just opinion generating websites. So helping young people think about that, but also think about, again, like I already mentioned, the role that algorithms are playing in shaping this online context that so many of us spend so much time in, right? So I have done work in high school classrooms very recently, teaching young people about algorithms where they admit that they have no idea what they are, right? And I think that that could be true for lots of us, that like we spend hours and hours on social media, and yet we don't understand the processes that are really influencing the information that comes across our screens. So I think, again, understanding algorithms, understanding their priorities, and how, again, they're putting information in front of us that engages us, either makes us angry or sad or excited, so that we stay on the platform and see more ads. And then finally, I think teaching people to, again, reflect on their own motivations and their reactions to information, so that, again, they're sort of like, our gut reaction to things is not necessarily what we act on, right? That we're able to like slow down enough, take a breath, think about accuracy, and then make a decision about whether to share or react or comment or use whatever that information is to inform an action or a decision that we might take.
Wonderful. So let me move to a slightly different angle. So in our lab, we're doing this project, Data for Ukraine, and we collect all this information. And politicians in Ukraine, after the invasion of Russia, increased the rate at which they were posting tweets in English dramatically. And that's because they were trying to connect with the international community to find some protection. And we, of course, are all the time commenting and intervening in politics outside of the US that we consider that is really important. At the same time, that means that there's a global environment that also intervenes in our domestic politics, and not just operations like Russian operations, but conservatives from England are commenting on Trump's election or defeat, and the same happens with Democrats in the US when they talk about Corbyn in the UK. So how do we manage this tension to have a democratic debate that is bounded by nations, and when we are concerned about this intervention from abroad, from bad actors, but in a way we're all the time interacting, and we're putting information in a lot of democratic systems and non-democratic systems that might resist our own comments there. So how do we manage, how we intervene abroad, and how do we manage how people from abroad intervene here?
Yeah, this is a fascinating question, and not to be the typical academic and dodge it, but say, Ernesto, we can't, we can't, if we're going to have a globalized media system, there's, which we do with the online world. And what's interesting about media systems, she said, getting up on her soapbox, is that they're very nationalistic, right? They have their own norms and rules and cultures and professionalism, types of ownership, ways of behaving. The British media, for example, are very different from the American media in a lot of key ways. So when we put it all together in one arena, there's bound to be both a lot of challenge to national media models, and also an inability to really know who you're talking to, right? Like, is that a Russian bot, or is that the guy down the street? Is this media outlet really based in the United States, even though it's written in English, or is it not? And this adds a layer to what Sarah McGrew is talking about, which is not only do you have this issue of, just navigating a new information environment that humans are very new to humans, and we're not really naturally wired for them. We're having to relearn how to do this. But now you've got this other layer of, is this information even coming from my fellow citizens? Is it really in my public sphere? What's really interesting, and perhaps if we could be hopeful for just a moment, even on the eve of another election, and we're all like, okay, how's it going to go? We're in much better shape than the Russians, because the internet or the digital sphere is not kind to authoritarian regimes who are, unlike China, unable to really control that sphere. So it's kind of a complete unknown as to not only are the Ukrainians much better at shall we say, projecting their narrative onto the world stage. And there's not only is because most people are kind of more on the Ukrainian side than on the Russian side, and that's one thing, but it's also because they're able to use the internet in a very fast, realistic, much more genuine feeling way than an authoritarian regime. They're not, the Kremlin really can't do, memes the way the Ukrainian public can. The other problem is, and this was one that I've studied Russian media for 30 years, and I did not anticipate that the far right nationalists would start to challenge Putin and tell him he's not doing this war well. He needs to have a much better strategy and he's a failure. And nor did the Kremlin say that. So just to summarize, the globalized internet, yes, it does create tensions and it brings in new elements and new concerns, into our public arena. But for democracy, we're pretty flexible and open. We're dealing with these issues. I think it's far more of a challenge to authoritarian regimes.
Thank you. So going to the election, clearly one boundary on this discussion on disinformation and misinformation is what happens when there's a party that is clearly committed to information that is considered misinformation, but is embraced as fact, and therefore you cannot quite educate for that. So for example, of course, with Stop the Steal, and the assumption that there was fraud in the 2020 election. Not only we have misinformation, we also have a misinformation that has been embraced for instrumental reasons and for political reasons as fact. So immunizing or educating for something that is politically motivated is quite difficult. So how do we deal with information that is that in a way has been shielded from correction by political motives?
Want to start, Sarah McGrew?
Sure. It's a great question. It's really in some ways like the question, right? But and I think unfortunately maybe Sarah Oates has a great answer, but I think that there's no silver bullet, right? If we knew the answer, we wouldn't be here. So I think just a few things to think about, and I think this is true in teaching, but also probably more true in like just our conversations with our family and friends in our own communities who may share some of these beliefs, right? Because we know that if people are going to change their minds, they're more likely to change their minds in response to someone who they trust, right? And so we have to do the work at a very, very local level. And I think it starts by this is hard to say, but you can't assume that the facts matter necessarily, right? That like people may be making choices, even either ignoring the facts, and so just arguing over facts and trying to like put facts in their face isn't likely to be very effective, right? It's more likely to like start from whatever connects you to that person and try to build from there. So one thing you could do, I've talked about how important it is to think about where information is coming from. So just start to have conversations about what their sources of information are and why they trust them, right? Really like probing into what the source of the expertise is for them, or the source of trust, and then share some of your own sources, the sources that you rely on and why you rely on them. And then just one more tip, and I'll turn it over to Sarah, is it's hard. I think it's hard to do this gently, but try to have conversations about who benefits if you believe that information, right? So like if you believe that the election was stolen, who's benefiting from that? And are you really benefiting, right? So like I think about a lot of the voters in Georgia who after the 2020 election believed that like massive election fraud happened and then didn't go vote in the 2021, special election for Senate, right? Like didn't voice their vote in and in some ways maybe that election hinged on that, right? And so whether that benefited those voters in the long term is a real question. So starting to have those conversations again with people who are within our communities.
Thank you. I'm not sure, Sarah Oates.
Well, I think Sarah McGrew gave a great and far more coherent answer. We've been talking about this in class lately, and we looked into a little bit of research, and it turns out that mail-in ballots don't necessarily helped Democrats throughout history. Sometimes they've helped Republicans, sometimes they've helped Democrats. And we had this weird perfect storm in 2020 of one of the candidates saying, I don't think mail-in ballots are going to be valid. So that, obviously discouraged his supporters from using them. And also you have very different opinions, generally based, not always, but often based on party affiliation as to whether COVID was a threat. So Democrats were more likely also to use mail-in ballots because they viewed it as more dangerous to go physically to the polls. All in all, what this meant is the Democrats had an advantage through this system. And it was, in a sense, a problem launched by the president himself, which, all right, he may have had this deep conviction and he felt this need to communicate that to the citizens, and that's his right. But tactically, it didn't work out well. And I agree with Sarah McGrew. I mean, the irony here is it's kind of what they call in soccer an own goal, right? If you really don't believe in democracy anymore, like you don't think that your vote's going to count, or you don't want to do mail-in ballots, and then it turns out on the day of the election you can't go or whatever, that's just going to hurt your ability of your candidates to stay in power. So I think that, or to get elected in the first place. So I think it's going to be really, really interesting to see not only the numbers and how people vote. Sarah McGrew and I and Ernesto, we all know education's changed forever because students discovered we could deliver things on Zoom. And so we're never going completely back, right, guys? They're on to us. Wow, I can go to class without leaving my dorm. It's fabulous. Now we discourage that. And if President Pines hears of this, I'm just going to say, we want them all back in the classroom. But it's the same with people. We're like, well, this is so convenient. I don't have to worry about dropping the kids off early. I can, do my ballot this way. So, yeah, I think that's an issue. And of course, I'm now wandering completely from the point. Ernesto, what was the prompt?
The prompt that we are talking about?
No. So how to get someone to how to encourage someone to rely on factual information as opposed to non-factual information, for example. So a researcher named Kate Starberg did some really interesting research on this, where she looked at why people believe things such as that school shootings were staged, or that shootings were staged. She looked at this very pervasive conspiracy theories, and she found that they're actually linked at their base to a belief that a deep state is controlling us, that the sort of government that we think of doesn't really exist. It's all a conspiracy, and there's these different actors in it. I think when you're talking to someone who believes in that the elections weren't valid, I think it's important to have a conversation. It's exactly as Sarah said, not just, well, who benefits from that belief, but to try and dig down a little deeper and to see if you can find some common ground about frustration, because this is something Democrats and Republicans share, frustration at governance, or frustration with a lack of progress on legislation, or the inefficiency of your local government office, or whatever you do. And I hope that's a way we can get to dialogue, because just sitting down with someone from the other side and saying you're wrong is just not going to get you anywhere, and it's not helpful to our civic democracy.
Yeah, and just to quickly say, like conspiracy theories offer offer a common enemy, but also sort of like offer hope in a path. Like if we do this, then like things will get better. So I think again, it goes back to that. And sometimes conspiracy theories are wrapped in white supremacy or racism, and in that case, I would say like we have to just reject them. But in the cases where it's possible to build empathy, like Sarah's talking about, I think it is worth investigating further.
I have a subject participant experiment in my own family where we attempt to, with two people from the opposite ends of the spectrum, and we do work very hard on building empathy. But yeah, sometimes you just have to take a deep breath and go, well, from a place of love,
It is. One interesting thing happening in the midterm elections is that misinformation looks to be less abundant, but maybe that's because everything is so fragmented because it's a midterm election. Do you think that we are in a low intensity election compared to the presidential, and therefore misinformation is less abundant, or just difficult to grasp because all the misinformation is more local and less readily available to big fact checkers and big scholars that are looking everything nationwide?
I'll go first with this because I'm going to be the Sarah McGrew and be pessimistic here. I'm just teasing her. I think the most disinformation is coming directly from Republican candidates who said that the 2020 election was stolen. Right? Factually, I don't think that's true. I don't think, and I think, run on your merits. And I actually think a lot of people in this country would support policies. Well, certainly polling suggests that they would support, moderate Republicans, perhaps even more than, right-wing Republicans. So again, it's just, if these people are elected and put into Congress and they're openly saying that elections are not valid, I'm very puzzled. How can we have a democracy? What's the plan B here, people? So it's the disinformation coming from the top down. It's not the disinformation that's constantly circulating on social media, either from domestic or international participants, in my view.
So,
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
I was just going to quickly that I think we're still not great at knowing the answer to that question, I don't think. And then part of that is because, a lot of disinformation, right, particularly is targeting minoritized communities, right, whether it's Black Americans or Spanish speakers in the US or Asian Americans, right? And we just don't have great ways of tracking misinformation in those, in the really localized ways that misinformation is being targeted, mis and disinformation are being targeted. So I think there's lots of room for improvement there. Sometimes it's not until after the fact, or too long after, it's a little too late that we recognize how much mis or disinformation was out there.
Yeah,
So,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead,
Sorry.
go ahead.
I just glanced at the Q&A, but only glanced, because if I read them, then I'll completely lose the train of thought.
I was just looking at one of them that is quite interesting, and it fits quite here, which is an anonymous attendee that says, how much do candidates and their staff rely on social media information and or disinformation to inform the campaign and shape their platforms? Which brings a very interesting issue of to what extent they are trapped, candidates and their staff are subjects of media disinformation, or they're producers of media disinformation. Now, we've been talking about candidates in a way in both ways. 60% of Republican candidates winning the primary embrace the stole the election false news. So we know that it's been embraced by the committee and produced. But are they also trapped? To what extent do you think that social media information informs the campaigns?
Oh, what a good question. I mean, I think it's really interesting because social media matters much more in campaigns that are close, right? And a lot of campaigns just aren't close. Which of course newspaper headlines never, they're never going to say 90 elections are close. These other 10 are interesting. That's kind of not how we do it. I think it is very challenging in a close campaign because I think election, particularly in Georgia, for example, the Warnock Walker race. Do you attack Herschel Walker for statements that seem to have been very much challenged by people in his life, or do you campaign on the issues? It's a tough one, but I think it's something they're paying attention to. And by the way, studies have shown it's something they really, really struggle with. The modern political campaigns really have not adapted, perhaps as well as they should, to mining and responding to social media campaigns.
Absolutely. Sarah, I saw.
I'll leave it with Sarah Oates. She's the political scientist here. So.
Okay. So I have I was trying to see other of the how can we get more visibility when created advocacy posts on social media? And which is a great question. I mean, something that we know from research is that fact checkers have significant difficulties to amplify their message when they're correcting, and that sometimes misinformations are shared. Let's say your student Sarah McGrew, they are more likely to share misinformation than fact checks. Can we educate for people to be actively fact-checking and actively correcting information and not just not sharing misinformation?
Yeah, I think we can, and I think there's quite a bit of research on debunking, right, that shows that it can be effective, and I think there's a few things to keep in mind there. First of all, we know that if people see other people being corrected on social media, they're more likely to have accurate views. So it can be useful to, if you have time and energy, to engage in making corrections. We know a few things about how to do that though, right? So first of all, you shouldn't do it by resharing the original post, right? Don't share the post that includes the misinformation, because that just spreads the post even more. And we know even if people think something is false, if they see it over and over and over, they're more likely to think it's true, right? This illusory truth effect. And if you are going to engage in a correction, it's really important to sort of follow a series of steps. And there's a great report from a couple of years ago called the Debunking Handbook that sort of like walks through how to engage in these effective corrections. But basically you need to sort of make a sandwich, right, around the misinformation, where you lead with the fact, right, and make it really simple and concrete and plausible, right? So you want to sort of fill the explanatory gap that the misinformation is creating or filling. So you want to fill the same gap. You want to warn that a myth is coming. You want to explain how the myth is misleading, like what's the fallacy that's at the heart of the myth, and then you want to reinforce the fact. So like I said, kind of like a truth sandwich around the misinformation, and that kind of correction or debunking can be effective in making people sort of start to shift their minds. It's not really effective to just say like, oh, you're wrong, or like this is the truth, without explaining, what I just walked through, why the myth is wrong.
Yeah, and I think people my age in particular cling to this idea that the internet is still kind of this collective wild, wild west place where you can sort of, build a presence through some clever blog posts or whatever. But in reality, the digital world is very much colonized by commercial and state interests. We freaked out. My 66-year-old husband, is actually pretty easy to freak out on a lot of levels, but we freaked him out by pointing out that Kim Kardashian can get up to $1 million per post. And he's like, no way, that's crazy money. And I'm like, there is crazy money online, honey. It's a whole economy. And so if you're just like an earnest, good person doing some volunteer fact checking or trying to raise money for your local organization, you're pretty much outgunned and outmanned in a highly professionalized, highly monetized environment. It is not the internet, the innocent internet, more or less, that we knew in the 1990s. So I think that's also a conundrum. I saw a question also about, talking about the violence in Ethiopia and why is this not visible, right? When everyone has an iPhone and everyone can be a witness. We hear about the violence in Ukraine, but we don't hear about it in other countries. And that segues to another question someone else said, well, what's the mass media role in all this? And the good news for a journalism professor is that the mass media do command a lot of attention from the information heights. They do set agendas, and they have definitely framed Trump differently from a few days after he lost the election to now. And that matters. In terms of how it doesn't matter for the true believers. In fact, it probably, gives them some support in some ways. But yeah, so it's this complicated media environment that a lot of people look at and they think, oh, it's a level playing field. No, not at all.
So let me put my political science jacket and say, we know that as people become more politically sophisticated and more educated and more attentive to politics, they become more biased, because motivated reasoning kicks in, and therefore the more they specialize and the more we say be attentive, be educated, be politically savvy, it is also the more likely we're creating in a way constituencies that are going to be more intense and maybe less tolerant. Are we working against us in how we are training, or can we make sure that as we educate and we train, we are also reducing motivated reasoning that is so prevalent, particularly when we're polarized?
Yeah, particularly in faculty meetings, I've noticed.
Oh, my faculty meetings are terrible, but motivated reasoning there is fine.
Yeah.
There's reasoning in faculty meetings. I had not noticed. More seriously, Sarah, do you want to take this?
Yeah, I
further?
mean, it's a super important question. I mean, I think maybe this is either pessimistic or optimistic. I'm not sure, but the truth is that like most people aren't specializing in politics, right? Like most people are just paying attention, as far as I understand it. Again, not the political scientist, but just paying attention at the very end, and then starting to make decisions. So it's not a huge risk for most people. I imagine that most of the people here, though, are very engaged and interested in politics. And again, I think there's still a lot of open questions about whether, I think we haven't tried to teach people about motivated reasoning and about steps we can take to counter it. So we don't know very well if that works. Like we know that, for example, paying people to not engage in motivated reasoning seems to work, but like we haven't tried to teach about it in schools, for example. So like I'm doing work right now with teachers to start to introduce, ideas about motivated reasoning and teaching students that on the issues they know and care about the most, they are most likely to engage in motivated reasoning on, right? The jury is still out on whether that makes any difference at all. Again, I'm an optimist when it comes to education, so I hope it does. But I think there's still just tons that we have to understand yet in this area.
Yeah, I think if professors have a religion, it's more knowledge and training is always good. And I totally take your point, and certainly have seen that in action at the American Political Science Association conference and other places. I've seen people using motivated reasoning in just ridiculous ways, right? But I do believe that, yeah, I think more tools, more knowledge, more awareness, it's always helpful. It may have some side effects, but I think it can only further civil society.
So let me bring another one of our colleagues here, Emily Smith, ask about branding and politics in the digital era, and the fact that we have to promote political views in such small, compact package means that we're all the time branding messages, and that branding becomes a well-known trend by politicians. Is branding a problem, and is digital media helping to create discussions that are less rich?
This comes up actually a fair bit in my class, and my classes, and I always remind students that a master of branding, a particular way of thinking about American politics, is Barack Obama. He was able to encapsulate in this notion of hope and in other ideas, a sort of different vision for America, as it were. By the same token, Trump is really, really good at branding. Hillary Clinton was terrible at branding. Let's just all be honest. So I don't think branding is a tool that is exclusively on the right and the left. I do think it is a way that we navigate our information spaces. And I think it's pretty value neutral. I think it's interesting that Brad Pascale, who was the social media manager for Trump in 2016, said after the election, when Trump won, he said, well, if I'd been a Democrat, they would have put my face on the cover of Time magazine and talked about this fantastic use of social media. So, and I think he had a point, right? In the sense that we have a tendency to judge things whether our side or the other side won. But yeah, I think in and of itself, the notion of branding to engage people in politics is not a bad thing.
Okay, so I'll bring another question that comes this time from Edward Allwood, and of course there's been a huge discussion about Section 230, and it was even used at some point as a threat by Donald Trump in order to try to put it in line some of the platforms as the election was hitting a couple of years ago. Is it really 230 something as shielding companies and that creates disincentives to moderate public space, or is it trivial and we see the same kind of results where 230 is not applicable as in the UK or a lot of countries in Latin America like Brazil or Chile? So is 230 that important or not?
Sarah, you want
Go
me
ahead.
to?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Ed is one of our fabulous journalism instructors. Hi, Ed. Yeah, 230 is huge. 230 is it's like Roe v. Wade. It's big. 230 is the get out of jail free card for social media platforms. It is no longer fit for purpose, and it needs to be updated desperately. And oddly, again, I think both the right and the left agree on this, perhaps not for exactly the same reasons, but both are deeply, deeply frustrated with the way in which social media platforms have shown again and again and again, they're going to put profit before civic health, in the same way that tobacco companies, until they were regulated, put sales in front of health. Nowadays, you can still buy cigarettes, right? But you buy them in an informed way, hopefully. And yeah, 230 is a huge problem.
It is interesting because, I was presenting once at Facebook, and we were chatting about how much content they need to moderate. So, we have 5 billion tweets Facebook posts, or 500 or 700 million tweets, and they have to be moderated on the fly. So as we replace 230 with something else, do governments, us, academics, educators, do we have the tools to moderate that content at level and participate in the war room that these companies have, so that we can produce results that are actually better?
Can I throw that question back to you, Ernesto? Because I know your work. I have an answer, but I think I'd rather hear what you have to say, because you do computational social science. And what would be your answer to that?
Yeah.
Oh, it's a huge mess.
Your answer,
I do think, my own pet story, at least that's the one that I've been trying to push in Latin America, is that these platforms should pay for the quality personnel that has to be in the war room moderating this. I think that the problem that we face in most of the global south is that the salary that you would have to pay for technically proficient personnel to be at level with the platforms to moderate this would produce huge political scandals if it came out. So this cannot be paid by most of the states in the global south. And if you want to moderate that content, you need platforms to actually chip in and pay for the salary of the people that need to have oversight. So it's not that simple of a problem I think, for the global south. But of course, in the US, we do have the resources. And that means that you can have joint moderation, but the question is, how do you do that? And of course, you're saying, I think correctly, that Democrats and Republicans want to change 230, but I'm not sure that one does not want to go to 210 and the other one to 260. So what's going to be the result of replacing it is way more complicated than just taking it down.
Well, yeah, and just so people know, 230 is the rule within a Communications Act that means that a platform is not responsible for the content, kind of the same way the cable company isn't responsible for the content of the shows. So it labels internet service providers, platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, as merely platforms and not moderators, which is ludicrous if you think about it. And also enraging for Republicans, because if that were true, why is Trump banned? And enraging for Democrats, because if that were true, why did Facebook allow, or if Facebook does what it claims it does, which is takes out dangerous disinformation leading to crimes, how did the Capitol insurrection happen? So my idea is the tobacco model. My idea is that the companies themselves have to pay for the remediation to the damage to society.
Yeah, I think it's so, like Ernesto said, it's just so complicated. And I think we have folks like Ernesto with so much expertise that could help the tech companies do a better job. But ultimately, there's still going to be some responsibility on us too, right? I think we wouldn't want to give all of that responsibility over to the tech companies either. And there's always going to be room for us to make better decisions about what to trust and what not to trust, or what to use to inform decisions. And we also need to do a better job educating and supporting people to make those decisions.
Well, it's like cigarettes, right? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. 50% of people who start smoking will die of smoking related diseases. I mean, it's just scientific fact, right? or I hope I'm quoting scientific fact. Let's just say a lot of people will die. But people
So,
choose to smoke anyway.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, that's your right as a human, I guess. So yeah, I mean, I agree with Sarah. People have to have agency. We can't be censors or nannies or, but let's just make it a less toxic environment for
Right.
all.
So thank you so much. We have time for one last question, and let me pose one sort of more light-hearted question. I think we all have shared misinformation at some point. So my question is, have you shared some misinformation and have to backtrack and send an email saying, I'm so sorry?
Wow,
I'm
that's-
sure that I have, but for somebody who studies social media misinformation, I don't spend a lot of time on social media myself, like personally. So I can't think of a specific example, although I'm sure, like you said, that it has happened in my life, and certainly like in my day-to-day life, I've shared misinformation.
I think I shared a premature celebrity death thing once. And I am sure
Oh yeah.
I'm sure I've done it.
Oh, I'm
Yeah.
positive.
I'm
I just don't
positive
keep
I've done it. But I can't, yeah, I can't, I'm just blanking on it. So,
None of us is
So-
immune, that's for sure.
yeah.
Thank you so much. I think we reached the end of the time. Ellie?
Yes, I'm just smiling, Sarah Oates, at your premature misinformation news that you had to share. That was great. Hopefully all of our attendees can just give a virtual round of applause to our amazing panelists and moderators this evening. It was such a lively discussion, and huge thanks to all the attendees who were really engaged in the questions that they asked. So thanks to all that were involved. We hope that you can join us for our next series in the UMDemocracy series. It'll actually be post-election, where we have some fabulous faculty experts really talking about and deciphering through what happened during the election. So please tune in for that. And we hope to see you at another event like this. And again, huge thank you to our panelists for your time and your expertise. And of course, a big go Terps to all of the Terps that attended tonight. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.